Boy 1 meets girl 1. They fall in love. Boy 2 meets girl 2. They fall in love. So far, so good. Now, boy 2 meets girl 1. He falls in love, forgets all about girl 2. Boy 2 betrays his friend boy 1 in order to have access to girl 2. After lots of chaotic back and forth, a trek through a forest, and boy 2 attempting to rape girl 1, the story ends. And it ends with a plot twist because boy 2 gives girl 2 to boy 1 as a kind of friendship gift. If this doesn't sound exactly appealing to you, you're in good company. Lots of critics and readers found the end of Two Gentlemen of Verona unimpressive, to say the least. But I hope that with us rereading the play, we can shake at those critical beliefs a little bit. I do have to say, though, that this ending turned what I thought straightforward comedy into a problem play. But then again, which Shakespeare play is not a problem play? So what we will do is to look at some historical context first. We will look at the sources, the dating, early performance history, later performance history, in order to be well aware where Shakespeare was at when he was writing this play. And then we will focus on three things. So that will be identity, senses of identity, through love, through friendship, this sort of triangle, a tense triangle of creating or thinking about who you are in terms of a lover and in terms of a friend. And then we will look at animals in the play, because Two Gentlemen of Verona is Shakespeare's only play with a live dog on stage. Shakespeare has been thinking about animals a lot. They're present throughout all his works, but an actual live dog on the stage was rare. This was the only play, and it was generally rare on the Elizabethan stage. So we need to think about, well, why does this dog appear here? And how does the dog stand in relation to identity and humanity? And then from that we look at the third, last theme, which is language. What does language do? What can it do in the world around us? Does it have agency? Does it make anything happen? And I think perhaps the play will surprise us with a relatively pessimistic point of view of language. I will also speak a little bit about how the themes of the play or reading the play impacted my own life. And I will think about that in terms of some pop culture, some culture, current culture, and that's the film The Banshees of Inisherin, which I happened to see while I was reading the play, and where I was able to draw some interesting and surprising parallels between Shakespeare and this film. And we will think a little bit about the impact of words and how we approach words nowadays. Hi everyone, it's Dr. Flo, your expert in all things blood, bodices, daggers and drama. I'm a researcher of Renaissance literature, and I write books on literature, language and culture for a public audience. This is my first book, An Admirable Point, a brief history of the exclamation mark. And if you have ever asked yourself why women use more exclamation marks than men, and how come Shakespeare never ever used an exclamation mark, have a look at my book, check it out. The info is in the description box below. 2023 is a momentous year for Shakespeare studies, because 400 years ago, Shakespeare's collected works came out, the Shakespeare Folio, without which we would have lost nearly half of Shakespeare's plays. So I will be reading one play or poem a week and making videos about them. How does the Folio and how do Shakespeare's works still impact us today and are relevant for us? If you want to join me on this journey, have a look at the video that is also in the description below, and let's read together. Now let's look at some longer summary of the play. So we have Valentine and Proteus. They're best friends. They live in Verona. Proteus is in love with Julia and she falls in love with him too. Valentine is free and he wants to see the world, so he goes to the court of the emperor in Milan. And he tells Proteus, why don't you come with me? We're young men. We need to learn something of the world and travel. Proteus says, no, I want to stay with my lady. You know, I'm so in love. I want to stay here. I can't bear being without her. So off Valentine goes. At the court of the emperor, he promptly falls in love with the emperor's daughter, Sylvia, who eventually also hears him, and they become a couple, a secret couple. Now, Proteus's dad says, well, this can't really go on here. You're just like some lazy, sloppy young man in love. You also have to go to the emperor's court and learn a bit about politics, learn a bit about life. So, heavy-heartedly, Proteus leaves Julia, swears, promises he will remember her and he will not start anything with any other woman at the emperor's court. Off he goes, and he joins his friend Valentine. Now, the moment he sees Valentine's lady, Sylvia, he falls head over heels in love. He forgets all about Julia, and he just becomes obsessed with Sylvia, although he doesn't show it. Sylvia, in the meantime, has another suitor, that is a guy that her dad, the emperor, chose for her, and who sort of stands in a competitive relationship with all the other men around her as well. Now, Valentine, the emperor finds out that Valentine and Sylvia are a secret couple or are in love, so he wants to get rid of Valentine. Proteus sees a chance to kind of get rid of his own friend and schmooze up to Sylvia, schmooze up to the emperor, so he betrays his own friend and Sylvia, and Valentine is banished from the court of the emperor, and Proteus has sort of access to Sylvia, although Sylvia doesn't want to hear anything about him. Meanwhile, in Verona, Julia misses Proteus so much that she just can't take it anymore. So she dresses up, she disguises herself as a boy, and she travels on her own to Milan, and she becomes a servant to Proteus, her own ex-boyfriend, as it were. And she suffers a lot because, of course, she notices him having fallen for somebody else and broken his vow. Now, Valentine in the forest joins a group of outlaws and sort of lives there like a Robin Hood kind of existence. Sylvia wants to join Valentine and asks a friend at the court to run away with her and to escape. So they manage to do that. They run into the forest. Proteus notices that, the emperor notices that, troops are being sent after them. Proteus goes through the forest and is also looking for her and actually meets her on her own because she's lost her way and she's lost her own friends and she's on her own, and he nearly forces her and nearly rapes her. Thankfully, he is being intercepted by Valentine, who also, of course, ambles around in the forest. And Valentine is shocked that his own friend has betrayed both his ex-girlfriend and him, Valentine, the best friend. And he's just aghast and they can't believe it. And this kind of shock suddenly makes Proteus come to his senses, and he says, I'm sorry, I'm ashamed, I made a mistake, and so on. And Julia faints and her disguise is revealed. She also shames Proteus and says, how can it be that you broke your vow, that you promised to me with all your heart and with all your honor? And Valentine is so affected by his friend's apology that he says, okay, you're such a good friend to me. If you want to be with my girlfriend, here she is, take her. But in the end, Valentine and Sylvia and Julia and Proteus pair off. The emperor arrives, the outlaws are rehabilitated, The guy that was supposed to marry Sylvia doesn't want her anymore, and the emperor is happy to give her to Valentine. Everybody is kind of happy, free, released. The old pairings have re-emerged again, and everything's fine, supposedly fine. I hope the story sort of makes sense. The most important thing to remember is there are two couples, two guys, two women, and one breaks his oath to his best friend and to his lady and falls in love with another woman. His best friend's girlfriend attempts to rape her in a dark forest. Thankfully is being found out, and the best friend gives his own girlfriend as a supposed gift to him that's then refused, and people return to their own previous partners. There is also a bit with a dog, so every so often, periodically, a kind of clown-like figure, a fool-like figure, Lance, who is the servant of Proteus, interrupts the action, or it kind of comes in, and there's a scene with him, and he has a dog. The dog is called Crab. And what exactly the role of Crab is and the role of Lance, who just kind of keep alternating with the main story, is what we are going to find out and think about as well. Let's look at the printing history of the play. Two Gentlemen of Verona is unique to the folio. That means we do not have any other pre-printed copy of the play. And in fact, we don't even have an entry anywhere in the stationer's register, for example. The stationer's register was kind of like an early copyright law organization. Not really. Copyright didn't exist at the time as such, but people were able to register a play or a book or whatever they wanted to be printed with the stationer's registry office. They would pay a kind of a fee, and then they had the right to the play, and they had to have that registered anyway because of the censure at the time. And it doesn't mean that a play that was registered was also always printed, but it's very useful for us to have this registry because we can see which publications were around that haven't been printed, or that we simply don't have anymore. Because unfortunately, actually, only around 20 to 30% of stuff that has been printed in the Renaissance is still around. So that's a huge loss for us, of course. That's simply because paper was being reused. It was relatively expensive. That was the most expensive part, actually, of books, was the paper. So people would reuse it. Like today, we would wrap our fish and chips in like some newspaper. Newspaper doesn't seem very special to us. So for people back in the days, they would reuse the paper, and they would just read and reread and pass around books. So the paper was just also being kind of used up by being passed around and put in a pocket and so on. So anyway, the Two Gentlemen of Verona is unique to the folio, so we only have that in this big book, and it has not been printed before. Now, only because it hasn't been printed doesn't mean that it hasn't circulated, and it doesn't mean that it hasn't been performed. Unfortunately, for this play, we also don't have any performance register, because usually theatre owners would keep records of the plays that were performed. Very often the plays would be performed in front of the king or the queen or some other nobleman. And we still have blurbs, for example, theatre blurbs, so like one-sheet papers with like a summary of the play, sometimes even in verse, sometimes even with a beautiful woodcut that they would paste up against, up to a pillar or the wall of the theatre, for example, or blurbs would be passed around, because just like nowadays, people needed teasers, people needed trailers, in order to know what the play that they paid for was about. That's just like today. So we don't have that for the Two Gentlemen of Verona either. We don't know which text eventually entered the folio. So it could be Shakespeare's own manuscript. It could be somebody who copied the manuscript. It could be a copy that was used for the theatre. It could be something that was reworked. So we just don't know. We don't know how the text came into the Folio, but we have one single record of Two Gentlemen of Verona, and that is from 1598. It's in a collection, a kind of compendium for young men at the time. It's a compendium that contains quotations by famous classical or contemporary authors. It contains sort of general knowledge about philosophy, music, history, and also literature. So it's kind of like the things that you have to know if you're like a young man about town who is making his way up the social structure, as it were. And the man who published that is kind of like a young man himself, Francis Mears, and he has these observations about literature too. So he compares classical authors with current English authors, and he says, well, our English authors are just as good as these classical authors. Here's what he says about Shakespeare. As Plato and Seneca are accounted best for comedy and tragedy among the Latins, so Shakespeare among the English is the most excellent in both kinds of the stage. For comedy, witness his Gentleman of Verona, his Error, his Love's Labour's Lost, his Love's Labour's Won, his Midsummer Night Dream, and his Merchant of Venice. For tragedy, his Richard II, Richard III, Henry IV, King John, Titus Andronicus, and his Romeo and Juliet. Now, there are other plays that Shakespeare wrote before 1598 that Mears does not mention. He also doesn't mention them in kind of the order that we think about them today, but it doesn't mean that he didn't like them, or it doesn't mean that he intended for his list to be complete at all. What is important for us is that he mentions those plays, and by 1598 those plays must have been around somehow. So it's possible that Mears saw a performance of Two Gentlemen of Verona, or perhaps there was some texts that were circulating. So 1598 is our last date of composition, as it were. By that time, the play must have been known somehow. So what is the earliest date that this play could have been written? Some critics say this is Shakespeare's first play, and it goes back to the late 1580s, early 1590s. It's certainly very, very early. It might also be that the Comedy of Errors was Shakespeare's first play, or The Taming of the Shrew. We don't know. It's sort of a cloud of a couple of plays that were probably written quite early in the 1590s, or in the late 1580s. Some sources of the plays can perhaps also tweak those dates. So there's sources for this play, and indeed other Shakespeare's plays, that are sort of pervading Shakespeare's work, and one of them is Ovid's Metamorphoses. So that is a Latin poetry collection about humans, mortals, but also other creatures like nymphs that turn into something else, like trees or rivers, for example. And we already hear the theme of transformation, and we hear an echo of Ovid's Metamorphoses in the name of one of the boys, or one of the guys, Proteus. Proteus was a classical god that was transforming himself into all different kinds of shapes all the time. So we have that text of shape-shifting and changing that's open for us. We have another couple of texts that are important for Shakespeare, for this play, as sources, and that is one, the Book of the Courtier, and the Book of the Governor. And both of those texts were hugely, massively important for the Renaissance, for the 16th century, because they were kind of trying to teach what a elegant person needs to know. As I said, Francis Mears and his Pallas Tamia was already kind of going into that direction. This is what you need to know if you want to be successful, if you want to go to a dinner party and be able to talk about literature, talk about music. It's very similar to us today. We still have kind of must-knows about this, about that, in order for us to sort of show that we have a certain kind of educational standing or a certain kind of knowledge. This was exactly the same at the time. And the Book of the Courtier and the Book of the Governor really had lists and had and had scripts and dialogues on what to say, how to behave in this situation or in that situation. Mind you, they were not for the common people. They were for people who were perhaps upper middle class, definitely noble people, and nobility. So in those books, it's all about what does it mean to be a good person, what does it mean to be a good friend, what are the virtues that a good person needs to have, and also about civility, about politeness. And those are themes that are very important for the Two Gentlemen of Verona. So that's an echo that we hear in the play as well. Now there's also an actual book that is a very obvious actual source for Shakespeare, so not kind of the cultural echo or stuff that Shakespeare was reading or had been reading at school, but an actual book. And that's a collection of stories called Diana by Montemayor. That's a Spanish writer, and they came out in 1542. We're not sure whether Shakespeare read Spanish, perhaps not, but then Spanish is sort of close to Italian and French, so perhaps he was able to glance at it. But there was also a French translation that was around, that I think came out in late 1570s or so, and then in the 1580s an English translation. While that hasn't been printed until after Two Gentlemen of Verona was probably written, Shakespeare likely saw a manuscript circulating. So we always need to be a bit careful and remember that only because something wasn't printed didn't mean that people wasn't reading it. It's just like us today. Somebody has a book and they lend it to somebody else, and that definitely happened in Shakespeare's time too. So Montemayor's Diana collection offers the subplot of the disguises, or offers some elements of Two Gentlemen of Verona as well. A last element of kind of evidence that we can use in order to think about the dating is Shakespeare's theatre company. Who were the people that were at his disposal, that he knew he was writing roles for? So there was a fool or a clown figure called Richard Tarleton that was part of Shakespeare's theatre company, and he was an incredibly famous comedian. He was incredibly loved. He was Queen Elizabeth's famous, most beloved comedian. Imagine Robin Williams or Mr. Bean. The whole world knows these comedians, and so Richard Tarleton was incredibly famous and incredibly well loved. He was famous for his improvisation, for his sort of physical humor. He was a very good dancer. He played several instruments, and he was able to sing, and he even danced. He's known to have danced a jig from Norwich to London, and then kind of making poems out of that, and so on. So it's likely that Shakespeare knew that he had this comedian at his disposal, and he was writing a role for him. So Tarleton was playing Lance, the kind of fool figure, with his dog Crab. And this is super important to remember, that Shakespeare wasn't just isolated in his little study writing plays that he just wanted to be read. First and foremost, especially at the beginning of Shakespeare's career, he was writing for a market. He wanted to make money. Certainly he also wanted to make history somehow or other, because one cannot but think and imagine that somebody who is writing this beautiful poetry just writes it in order to make a pound, right? So for sure we can see Shakespeare being interested in his craft and in his art as well. But he was also a man of his time, and of any time, in fact, and he was also just interested in making money and becoming wealthier. So he knew for whom he was writing, and he knew how to use his actors. And we can also see a change in especially the fool and the clown roles later on, as his theatre cast changes and he adapts kind of his style and his focus and the characters that he includes in his plays and the speeches that he writes for them according to who he has at his disposal. And this is, I think, a really beautiful circumstance of Renaissance theatre, because it was about collaboration, it was about working together, it was about figuring out the best way to stage this play and the best way to make money, or have the play go to the Queen and be played at the Queen. Now, how has the play been received in its own time and today? Well, in fact, the early performance history of Two Gentlemen of Verona is incredibly patchy, so we don't actually have any information on any performance, even in Shakespeare's lifetime or shortly after. And the first performance after it was printed in the Folio in 1623 is in 1762 in a theatre in Drury Lane in London. So that's 150 years after it's been printed. Somehow or other, it didn't really talk to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the time, apparently. And in fact, in the performance in Drury Lane in 1762, there was only one night of performance. It was supposed to be scheduled for much longer, but apparently people didn't like it, and it was a bit of a disaster. As we go along, Two Gentlemen of Verona is staged a little bit more often, however, not in Shakespeare's version, not in the Folio version, but people write an alternative ending. They cancel out Valentine's friendship offer of his own girlfriend to the man who was about to rape her. So that seems extremely unpalatable and undigestible to people, so they write it out, they write different endings. This is very common, in fact, especially in the 18th century and in the late 17th century. And when we look at King Lear, we will also touch upon people rewriting the end of King Lear because it seemed too sad for them. So people have always done something to Shakespeare, stretched him, squeezed him, and we still do that today, because the Two Gentlemen of Verona has now, like all of Shakespeare's plays, been translated in lots of different languages and has been staged in Poland, in Zimbabwe, in the UK, in different languages. I also think that it's important to not dismiss the Two Gentlemen of Verona out of hand, because for us nowadays, with a whole century of different kinds of literary theories that have impacted literature studies such as queer theory, animal studies, and feminist theory, we can go back and really find a lot of material in plays that are maybe not the most enjoyable to watch. My title, Love and a Bird with a Dog, is from the film Shakespeare in Love from 1998, which is the most amazing, beautiful Shakespeare film you could ever watch. It's one of my favorite movies. If you don't know it, please go and watch it. It's so beautiful and lovely and sweet, and actually very, very clever, because the way that they portray the collaborative nature of theatre at the time is not too far off what it was like, although there's lots of things that the film obviously doesn't get right and takes creative liberty with in terms of Shakespeare's life. But what the film does is show Shakespeare at the beginning of his career, and he has just successfully written and performed Two Gentlemen of Verona, and there's a scene where Queen Elizabeth watches the play at court with her courtiers, and Gwyneth Paltrow, the Viola character, is there as well and loves it and loves the poetry, because the play is actually quite lyrical in many passages, whereas the Queen loves the bit with the dog, and the dog is just being a very unruly actor, and she loves the comedy of that. And Philip Henslow, the theatre owner, tells Shakespeare, hey, for your next play, why don't you write, people want comedy, love and a bit with a dog, because Shakespeare has sort of writer's block and he doesn't know what to do, and he has some kind of idea about a boy, a guy called Romeo, and then Ethel, the the pirate's daughter. So that's, of course, the play that becomes Romeo and Juliet. And I think what the film interestingly puts its finger on is that Two Gentlemen of Verona was a very early play and focus on the dog, interest in the dog, but also that it comes across as Shakespeare's apprentice play. So it's kind of very often seen as the play where Shakespeare already uses lots of plot strands and plot devices and thematic interests and locations, actually, that will return in later plays. There's the Italian setting that we have in lots of later plays. There's the disguise, a woman dressing up as a man, following her own love interest, for example. There's the sort of evil parent that wants to split the lovers. So there are lots of elements that Shakespeare will recycle in tragedies and comedies later on. Now, it is true that the end seems too neat and too tidy and too fast, and is actually sort of very absurd, possibly even to people at the time. A famous critic, Tilliard of 1965, says, "It has been pretty well agreed that this scene is morally and dramatically monstrous, that a proposal to hand over a girl to the man who has just proposed to rape her will waltz our moral sense, and that the perfunctory speed with which these staggering events are recounted can only provoke our laughter." Others have said it's an accomplished comedy, and it would be misplaced to see problems when people back then perhaps didn't see problems. Another scholar, Muriel Byrne, in 1957 says, "Should one ask more of this play, or are we entitled to believe that the youthful author's intention was to poke some good-humoured fun, prettily spiced with light irony at certain fashionable attitudes then current in life and literature, in order to divert?" So the inconsistencies and irregularities are our problem. They're not really Shakespeare's or not the problem of people at the time. We are uncomfortable with it, and we can speculate how that would have come across for people at the time. However, we have to keep in mind that our sensibilities are different, and it doesn't mean that one is better than the other, or one is more developed or advanced or whatever than the other. They're just different. And rather than to rehash negative opinions or theories about the ending, I want to maybe recuperate the play by looking at other aspects of it that I think are interesting and are worth digging up, as it were.